Ask any owner-operator who ran one. The C15 6NZ is the best diesel Caterpillar ever built, and then they'll tell you the government killed it. They're right about the first part. There's a reason you can't walk into a dealer today and order a new one. There's a reason a clean pre-emission 6NZ now sells for a premium over engines half its age. Why a man will pull a tired core out of a wrecked truck and pay to have it rebuilt rather than touch anything newer. And that reason has almost nothing to do with the EPA writing rules that were too strict. It has everything to do with a decision Caterpillar made in a courtroom, years before most of these trucks ever turned a wheel. To understand why men hold on to these engines the way they do, you have to understand what the 6NZ was. A pre-emission C15, mechanically straightforward. No diesel particulate filter clawing back your power, no regeneration cycle baking the exhaust, no urea tank to keep topped off. An engine you could diagnose by ear and rebuild in a shop bay that would run well past 1,000,000 miles if you treated it right. It made its power honestly, and it didn't strangle itself doing it. That is the machine. In October of 1998, Caterpillar was not the victim of the Environmental Protection Agency. It was a defendant. CAT was one of 7 engine makers caught running software that could tell when an engine was sitting on the federal test stand. On the stand, the engine behaved. It passed clean. Out on the highway, with nobody measuring, it quietly dumped extra nitrogen oxide. A defeat device. The settlement carried an $83.4 million civil penalty, the largest environmental civil penalty in the country's history at the time. And buried in the consent decree CAT signed was a single line that would shape the next 10 years. Caterpillar agreed to meet the 2004 emissions standard starting in October of 2002, 15 months early. The deadline every trucker blames for killing the C15 was never a deadline at all. It was a sentence, and Caterpillar had agreed to serve it. When that pulled-forward deadline arrived, every other manufacturer did the same thing. They swallowed cooled exhaust gas recirculation, EGR, routing hot, dirty exhaust back into the intake to cool the burn and choke down the NOx. It cost fuel economy, it added heat, and the engineers hated it. But it was legal. Caterpillar was the only major builder that refused. Instead of meeting the standard, CAT kept selling engines certified above the legal limit and wrote the government a check on every single one. The penalty on a heavy-duty engine putting out 3.5 grams ran $6,946 apiece. And by design, that number was built to climb every year. Every competitor obeyed the law. Caterpillar bought its way past it, one engine at a time. Those bought-off engines carried a prefix, MBN. And the trucks that got them were strangled. The computer pulled timing and fuel so hard just to scrape under the rules that the engines ran hot, drank fuel, and wouldn't climb a grade the way a CAT was supposed to. Drivers had their own name for the MBN, one the marketing department never printed. Much bad news. Here's the part nobody saw coming. Those engines were mechanically simple, with almost no emissions plumbing to speak of. Once owners worked out that they could reflash the computer and undo the factory strangling, the Much Bad News platform quietly became one of the most wanted C15s on the used market, second only to the 6NZ itself. The engine Caterpillar built as a stopgap outlived the strategy behind it. The real answer, the one CAT poured millions of marketing dollars into, was called ACERT. And the whole pitch was that ACERT was the engine that did not need EGR. Series twin turbochargers, variable valve actuation, multiple injection events on every stroke, all of it engineered to kill the NOx inside the cylinder before it ever formed, so Caterpillar would never have to feed exhaust back into a clean engine the way everyone else was. It was a point of pride. It was the whole brand promise. And then, to meet the tighter 2007 soot limit, Caterpillar quietly bolted a low-pressure exhaust gas recirculation loop onto the ACERT engine, They simply refused to call it EGR. They called it clean gas induction, the same three letters, as it happens, that also stand for compacted graphite iron. Most people assume the ACERT was just a 6NZ with a second turbo hung off the side. It wasn't. The ACERT used a longer stroke, borrowed from the bigger C16, and a completely different piston, a one-piece steel slug, where the pre-emission engine used a two-piece articulated design. That's why the parts don't all interchange between them. And it's why the factory power ratings across these engines swung across a spread that would embarrass most engine families, from early 6NZ versions rated as low as 375 horsepower, all the way up to a factory 625 horse ACERT, making over 2,000 pound-feet of torque. Same name on the valve cover, two completely different engines underneath. And the newer of those two engines was trouble. The 2007 spec C13 and C15 carried the CAT regeneration system to burn off the soot the new rules demanded. And customers started reporting that engines built between 2006 and 2009 would lose power and shut themselves down out on the road. The complaints became proposed class actions. The class actions became a settlement. So be clear about exactly which engine these drivers worship. It is not the ACERT. It is the pre-emission 6NZ, the last C15 Caterpillar ever built before the law caught up with it. The engine everyone chases is precisely the one CAT was forced to stop making, which brings us to the part every trucker gets wrong. On June the 12th, 2008, Caterpillar announced it would not build a 2010 compliant on-highway engine. Not that it couldn't, that it wouldn't. Because by then, on-highway truck engines were a sliver of Caterpillar's diesel business. The company was already turning out roughly 400,000 diesel engines a year for everything that wasn't a highway truck: mining, marine, power generation, rail. One company director put it about as plainly as a man in a suit ever does. The writing was on the wall for independent engine suppliers. Caterpillar didn't get killed by the EPA. It ran the numbers, looked at a low-margin business wrapped in a consent decree and a stack of lawsuits, and walked away. A portfolio decision, dressed up as a forced exit. But Caterpillar still wanted its name on a truck, so it did something that looks, in hindsight, close to suicidal. It tied its entire on-highway future to the one company in America betting even harder than CAT ever had on a future with no EGR and no urea: Navistar. While the rest of the industry adopted selective catalytic reduction, spraying urea into the exhaust stream to neutralize the NOx after the fact, Navistar went all in on EGR alone, pushed to the absolute limit, in an engine line called Max Force. It was a disaster. Navistar's own engineers told their supervisors that the amount of EGR management was demanding simply was not possible, not as a cost problem, as a physics problem. The company shut down its backup work on SCR anyway, and according to the lawsuits that followed, threatened to fire employees who so much as discussed the alternative. The engines failed in the field again and again. It ended in a $135 million class action settlement, a separate jury verdict in which an executive testified under oath that the company, in his words, did not test it, an SEC suit against the chief executive, and Navistar finally crawling to Cummins, its old rival, to buy the SCR engines it had sworn it would never need. Think about what that meant for Caterpillar. The company had walked away from building its own engine partly to escape the cost of compliance, and then bolted its truck program to a partner whose entire compliance strategy was detonating in federal court. And the Caterpillar truck that was supposed to be the comeback? The CT 660 rolled out in 2011 with a proud CAT badge on the nose. Underneath, it was a Navistar. Navistar's design, Navistar's build, assembled in Mexico. The whole experiment lasted about 5 years. In February of 2016, Caterpillar announced it was discontinuing its vocational trucks altogether. There was never a real return to the road. The badge came off for good, which should have been the end of the C15. The company had quit. The comeback had failed. The engine everyone wanted was a discontinued pre-emission relic that hadn't come off a line in years. Except the 6NZ refused to die, and the way it stayed alive turned into a national scandal. There's a loophole called a glider kit. You take a brand new truck, new frame, new cab, new everything, and instead of a modern, emissions-choked engine, you drop in a rebuilt pre-2007 diesel. A clean 6NZ in a brand new Peterbilt, legally exempt from the emissions hardware bolted to every other new truck sold that year. For a small fleet, the math was obvious. The power and the simplicity of an engine they already trusted, in a truck with none of the modern emissions headaches, often for less than a new, compliant tractor. Builders like Fitzgerald turned it into an empire, putting out more than 3,500 of these trucks a year. The EPA moved to close the loophole in 2016, capping the exempt builds at fewer than 300 per manufacturer. And then, in November of 2017, the agency reversed itself after a lobbying push led by Fitzgerald, leaning on a Tennessee Tech study that Fitzgerald had helped pay for. The study was so compromised that its own lead investigator pulled his name off the work and filed a research misconduct complaint. The EPA's own staff had estimated that those glider trucks, built specifically to keep engines like the 6NZ on the road, could cause as many as 1,600 premature deaths a year. The engine these men trusted had outlived the company that built it. It just needed a body count to get there.